8 seasons of My Hero Academia are in the books, y'all. This is one of my favorite shows, and because of all of the themes of childhood trauma, there is so much to talk about. But today in this video, I want to focus on the Todoroki family. If you've followed me on my other social media channels, you may know that I started out my career in a domestic violence agency, so this is an issue that is very close to me. I really appreciate how My Hero Academia attempts to tackle the issue of domestic violence in a sensitive way that is geared towards the restorative justice model. But is it successful? Today, I'm going to consider 3 central questions about My Hero. Number 1, is the show's portrayal of domestic violence realistic? Number 2, does the show teach a healthy message about domestic violence? And number 3, does Endeavor deserve his redemption arc? And does he fumble it? Or does he truly redeem himself? This video will contain spoilers for all 8 seasons of My Hero Academia. So without further ado, let's get into it. My name is Catherine, I'm a licensed therapist, and this is Nerd Therapy. First things first, we need to define our terms. In this video, I am going to use the following definitions. Domestic violence is a pattern of behavior which involves the abuse of one family member by another. Intimate partner violence is a pattern of abusive behavior by a person seeking to have power and control over their romantic partner. So the key difference is that domestic violence can be committed against any family member, while intimate partner violence applies specifically to a romantic partner. Now, these are not universally agreed upon definitions. Not everybody uses these terms the way I do, and there is a separate conversation to be had litigating the use of the terminology, but that's not what we're talking about today. Throughout this video, I may use DV and IPV interchangeably because IPV is a type of DV. I am including both concepts and both definitions because Endeavor commits abuse against both his wife and his children, and both types of abuse are kind of inextricably linked together and I think need to be discussed together because they ultimately have the same causal origin. So now that we've defined our terms, let's start digging into these dynamics in the show and see how realistic they actually are. Part 1. The relationship between Enji and Rei. We know that this marriage was an arranged marriage and that Rei's father quickly agreed to it because of Endeavor's status and wealth. We are told that Rei had the option to refuse his proposal, but she accepted it of her own free will. Rei herself confirms in one of the flashback scenes that she did enter the marriage of her own free will, but the context of her accepting the proposal is that her family was struggling financially, and there would be some relief brought to her family because of Endeavor's wealth. The degree of pressure that Rei was under to accept this marriage proposal is left very ambiguous. Did she truly feel free to say no if that wasn't what she wanted, or was this a situation where she could have said no, but if she did, she would have faced shaming, chastising, or abuse from her family? We'll probably never know the answer to this question, but I do find it valuable to at least speculate about it because the context informs what ends up happening to Rei when she ultimately enters the marriage. Being abused in your own family of origin is a risk factor for being more vulnerable to ending up in an abusive romantic relationship yourself. Again, we don't know if Rei's family actually was abusive, but if she was being pressured into accepting this marriage arrangement, even if it wasn't what she wanted, then that's potentially evidence of the possibility that she comes from an abusive situation. We don't really see anything from the early years of the marriage, but there is an implication that Endeavor's abuse began or escalated after Toya began to sustain injuries from using his quirk. Let's take this scene with Toya as a young boy. From the facial expressions and tone of voice between the two of them, it seems that Toya and his father have a positive relationship. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean that there was no abuse happening. However, I am pointing out the contrast between this dynamic and this dynamic to illustrate a common phenomenon that happens in DV relationships. Oftentimes, there is a turning point after which the abuse dramatically escalates. It often happens either right after the couple gets married, right after the first child is conceived or right after the first child is born. But there are other stressors that can cause an abuser to dramatically turn up the volume on their tactics. In the context of My Hero Academia, it makes sense that Endeavor escalates his abuse after Toya begins to sustain injuries from using his quirk. After all, Endeavor wants one thing, and that is to have a child who can surpass All Might. And as soon as he realizes that he's not going to get his way, he can't handle it. This is a man who is so emotionally immature that he is incapable of coping with not getting what he wants. And as he's desperately trying to cling on to this grandiose objective that is slipping away from him, he takes his frustration and his rage out on his family. The dynamic in the household has many of the quintessential features of a typical domestic violence dynamic. One child attempts to protect the non-offending parent from the offending parent. You have an older sibling protecting a younger sibling. The pitch black shadows in so many of the shots represent the culture of fear that NG has created in the house, as well as the culture of secrecy that so often surrounds abuse. I'll take a closer look at the effects on the children later in this video, but for now, let's stay with the abuse against Rei and see where it fits in the power and control wheel. This wheel is a tool that illustrates the types of abuse that perpetrators of IPV use to maintain power and control over their partners. Physical violence, perhaps the most obvious indication of DV, is on the outside of the circle because it is used as a high-level enforcement tactic. Abusers typically only employ physical violence as a strategy after one of the strategies on the inside of the circle has failed in their efforts to gain control over the other person. Endeavor's tactics fall under using intimidation, using emotional abuse, and I think also using male privilege. Endeavor does act like the master of the castle. He abdicates himself from the compassion labor that is required of parenting with the excuse that he needs to focus on work and the only thing he knows is the world of heroes. His whole character reeks of toxic masculinity. The arrogance, the oscillation between rage and stoicism, the obsession with beating someone else in a physical contest, the obsession with being number one. He's incapable of engaging with his children softly, which is why he either trains them into the ground or rejects them. This version of the power and control wheel does not include a category for reproductive abuse, but that is obviously one of the main offenses that Endeavor commits. By Endeavor's account, he claims that the decision was mutual between him and Rei to have more children, but I don't necessarily think that we should trust him as a reliable narrator on this. It's plausible that he may have sabotaged birth control, or he may have used coercive control or even physical force to force Rei to have more children. Now, let's take a look at how Rei is affected by the abuse and consider whether this is a realistic portrayal of what CPSD looks like in an IPV survivor. One of the pivotal moments in the lore of My Hero Academia is when Rei burns Shoto with hot water because the left side of his face reminds her of his father. This scene paints a portrait of a woman who is petrified and is likely going into a full-blown flashback. The clinical definition of a flashback is an intense experience of a memory that actually makes one feel like they are reliving the traumatic event. The person who is having the flashback temporarily loses touch with the here and now. Because Rei has been terrorized by her husband for so many years, just looking at her child's face that reminds her of her husband is enough to trigger the flashback and send her nervous system into a full-blown fight-or-flight state, during which time she commits the violent act. Endeavor hospitalizes his wife not for the sake of helping her recover, but because he wants to prevent her from doing more damage to his masterpiece. It is not uncommon for abusers to weaponize the mental health system or the carceral system to threaten their partner into complying or just straight up getting rid of them. It's a tactic the abuser uses to gain power and control over the other person. In this case, Endeavor doesn't really want control over his wife primarily. His main objective is control over Shoto, and he views Rei as an obstacle to getting that control. Given that Endeavor himself hurts Shoto all the time, his reasons for hospitalizing his wife can't really be about protecting him from harm. It's primarily about getting Rei out of the way so that she can't interfere with Endeavor abusing Shoto the way he wants to abuse him. It's not clear whether Rei stays hospitalized for so long because her mental condition really is that bad to warrant keeping her there for 10 years, or because Endeavor is keeping her prisoner there because he doesn't want to deal with her. It is plausible that someone who has been so severely abused for so long and then is faced with the death of one of her children could be experiencing so much damage to their psyche that they can't stabilize outside of a long-term care facility. But there is also the possibility that Endeavor really is keeping her captive there so that she doesn't get in his way of his plans for his youngest son. I do wish that we had gotten more of Rei's perspective on this, and I wish that we had gotten to hear her speak more in general. That would be one of my main critiques of the show. She really is more of a background character. Her journey of suffering and recovery is not central. It more serves as a vehicle to inform the emotional journeys of the other characters. And I understand that in a show that already has so many characters, there isn't necessarily enough time to give more stage time to a character who is not really central to the plot to defeat the antagonists of the story. But if this is a critique about domestic violence and how it is portrayed in the show, I think that the show would have done more justice to Rei, Endeavor's first victim, if it had allowed her to speak more about her own pain. Chapter 2, the abuse of the children. One thing I think My Hero Academia does a good job of is showing how children who come from the same family can have wildly different trauma responses. Toya acts out, engages in self-harming behaviors, and is ultimately preyed upon by a villain because of his father's failure to provide guidance and protection. Fuyumi takes up the role of trying to keep the family together. Her coping strategies are being overly idealistic and, I would venture to say, toxically positive. Natsuo finds refuge in his rage and his anger and is determined to have nothing to do with his father. And Shoto throws all his energy into achieving greatness in the hero world, but is determined to do so in a way that levies as much spite against his father as possible. 4 very different responses, all of them valid. All of them realistic. I'm going to zoom in a little more on Shoto and Toya's presentations because those are the ones that are most fleshed out. When we first meet Shoto, he comes across as cold and unfriendly. He clearly prefers to work alone and only engages in groups when he's forced to by the rules of a competition. He sees himself as being in a different class than his peers, and I don't think that's just because of his skill level. Personality-wise, he feels more like an adult than a 15-year-old boy. In the beginning of the story, he almost never smiles. Now, with some of these characteristics, it's not clear whether they are due to trauma or autism.
If I smile, then they'll die?
But this is a video about the trauma of family abuse, so I'm going to focus on that angle. We learn later that Shoto was sequestered from his siblings, which could have inhibited his development of social skills. His reluctance to trust others makes sense, given that his home wasn't safe. That, plus he probably has shame about his family, as most abused kids do, and letting other people get close means they potentially find out about the things you'd prefer to keep secret. Shoto has the personality of a kid who was forced to grow up too early. This explains the complete lack of joy in his demeanor. Shoto is determined to become a hero, but he seems to be equally determined to make his father angry by rejecting him. He refuses to use his firepower in battle because he sees it as an action that would validate his father's arrogant ambitions. and he's determined not to give Endeavor the satisfaction. A lot of us may identify with and or support Shoto's insistence on not using his firepower in order to reject his father. Other stories in the world of fantasy and heroes may even cast this kind of decision as noble and virtuous. However, anime has a way of sometimes teaching you a lesson you didn't expect to learn. And as it turns out, for Shoto, the lesson he needs to learn is how to be less rigid in the way he thinks about his own abilities. Black and white thinking is a very common CPTSD symptom. It's a coping strategy that seems to promise safety and predictability by sorting everything into good or bad categories. But the limitation of it is that the world we live in is not black and white. And trying to maintain this rigid thinking in a world full of ambiguities, it limits our adaptability and it stunts our emotional development. During their match at the sports festival, Izuku Midoriya calls Todoroki out on the arrogance of thinking that he can win with only half his strength. The most powerful line in this match,
It's yours! Your quirk, not his!
is a desperate plea for Todoroki to see his own quirk in a different way. Abused children can often fall into this trap where they build their whole personality around not being like their parents, so much so that they actually forget to develop a positive sense of identity. They are so focused on that question of who do I not want to be, they never ask themselves, who do I want to be? Another common thing that happens in people with traumatic childhoods is that they develop this tendency to only remember the bad stuff. And this is a survival mechanism. The brain becomes primed to only pick out what is dangerous. But that focus on exclusively negative things comes at the cost of being able to allow in the positive from your past, your present, and your future. Before their match, Todoroki says that in every memory of his mother, he only sees her crying. But during the fight, Midoriya's encouragement allows Todoroki to remember a positive and empowered lesson that his mother offered to him. You are not a prisoner of your lineage. It's okay to use your power. Remembering this positive memory gives Shoto more strength than his rage against his father ever could. With encouragement from his new friend and love from his mother as driving forces, Shoto breaks through the blockages of his own rigid thinking and claims his power in a new way, one that has nothing to do with his father. This is the beginning of Shoto decentering his father from his story and developing a narrative that belongs to him alone. And then in the final match against Bakugo, all the intrusive thoughts come rushing in and he withdraws the flame. And that's realistic. Growth and recovery are not linear processes. One moment we are taking a courageous step forward, and then the next we are shrinking back into the comfort zone. That's what a real journey looks like. After the sports festival, there's a conversation that happens between Shoto and his mother that we don't get to see. And I so wish that we could have seen it. If you've read the manga, let me know in the comments, is this dialogue included in the manga? I just think this could have been such a powerful opportunity to kind of wrestle with the moral ambiguity of abuse and trauma responses in parents who are both victims and perpetrators. Shoto says the reason he never visited his mother is that he thought that the sight of his face would cause her pain, like it did all of those years ago. But I can't help but wonder if Shoto may also be harboring some anger towards his mother that he isn't letting on. Even if Rei is a victim in this situation, it would be okay for Shoto to feel angry at her. This is part of breaking out of the black and white thinking. Two things can be true at the same time. We can hold the reality that Rei is a victim of her husband's abuse, and also that she caused harm to her child in a serious and violent way. And I just wish that we could have gotten to see Rei repair that harm in real time. But I can't always have what I want. Now let's take a look at Toya, who unambiguously faces the worst outcome of any of the children. From what I can gather from the flashback scenes, it doesn't seem like Toya experiences the degree of physical abuse that Shoto gets. Toya's wounding instead comes primarily from neglect. Endeavor casts Toya aside once he's no longer useful in his rapid quest for power. He completely ignores his son's need for connection and attempts to parent him using rage and intimidation. But Toya isn't even fazed by his father yelling at him. You can see how he looks straight through his father's anger and remains desperately focused on his efforts to gain his dad's praise and approval. This often happens with children who are emotionally neglected. They are so starved for attention that they don't react normally to being yelled at. A lot of kids who are emotionally neglected will opt to misbehave because it gets them negative attention, and they see that as being better than getting no attention at all. Toya is literally destroying himself in an effort to reach his father. The pivotal moment in the lore of Rei Todoroki is when his father doesn't meet him at Sokoto Peak. Let that sink in for a moment. The worst thing that happens in Toya's life, the thing that sets him on the horrible path he ends up going on, is not something that his father does. It's something that he doesn't do. I'm hammering this point pretty hard because one of my missions as a therapist on the internet is to bring real awareness and consideration and validation to the harms of childhood emotional neglect. Toya doesn't get beaten and pushed to physical extremes the way Shoto does. He gets dismissed, ignored, cast aside, thrown away. The pain he carries is from the break in the bond with his father. Research that has looked at the effects of different parenting styles, authoritarian, authoritative, dismissive, and uninvolved, shows that uninvolved parenting always yields the worst outcomes. And this is not to make a contest of who has suffered more, and it's not to say that there is some universal truth. I know there are some people out there who would say, you know, I wish my dad had fucked off and left the family because I was sick of him abusing us all the time. And if that's you, that's valid. I see you. The point I'm trying to make here is that Toya's suffering comes primarily from the lack of something positive, not the presence of something negative. Without a safe home to go back to, Toya sets himself free in a wayward underground world and eventually takes up refuge with the League of Villains. All humans have a drive to seek safety and connection somewhere. Violent, dangerous, amoral people make better company than no company at all. Chapter 3, Endeavor's Redemption. After All Might's retirement, there begins a shift in Endeavor's character. He becomes less cartoonish and more multidimensional. Whereas before he was surrounded by a wall of arrogance, he's now showing signs of being affected by what his sons think of him. This is an important shift because no abusive person will be able to change their behavior unless they have the ability to self-reflect. Endeavor's first serious moment of reckoning comes after Natsuo is kidnapped by the Pavement Lines villain. This is the first time we see him show physical affection to one of his children, and he makes a declaration that he wants to atone. The action that he comes up with for his atonement is that he is going to build another house for Rei and the kids to live in, and that he is going to stay away. Now, for some survivors of DV, this may be exactly what they want. Give me some sort of financial reparation and then leave me the fuck alone. But Endeavor hasn't actually asked Rei what she wants. He knows more or less what his children want. Natsuo wants him to get lost, Fuyumi wants the family to be reunited, and Shoto seems to be agnostic about his relationship with his father at this point. Endeavor knows he can't make all of them happy, so he picks a solution without having a real conversation. This is a very realistic step that an abusive spouse or parent might take when they are trying to make the situation better. The logic is very rudimentary. I've done something wrong, I have to do something to fix it, let me throw money at this problem and then just remove myself from the situation so I don't do any more damage to it. Again, this is exactly what some survivors of DV want, but in this situation, it's unsatisfactory. Endeavor's determination to stay away is not actually an act of growth in respecting boundaries. It's an abdication of the responsibility of doing the real work that is required to have a healthy relationship with your children and your spouse if that's what she wants. It's much easier to say, I'll just leave you alone, than to sit down and have a real conversation about what kind of father, what kind of person your kids and your wife actually want you to be. Endeavor's not there yet. He's at the point where he's able to admit that he's done wrong, but not at the point where he's able to be truly vulnerable with the people he's harmed. In terms of crafting an engaging story that is also realistic to human psychology, I think this is a great way of showing that he is making progress, but he's not there yet. The next step in Endeavor's redemption process comes when we get the big reveal that Toya is still alive, and he's been in the League of Villains this whole time, all because Endeavor abandoned him to burn to death on that mountain. Now, between failing to capture Shigaraki and the other members of the League in this battle, and being outed as a domestic abuser whose own son went and joined the bad guys, Endeavor is at a pretty low point here. Rei, newly released from her long-term hospitalization, comes to talk to her husband about Toya. She takes responsibility for the role she played in Toya's neglect, and the two of them begin to process what's happened to their son. Enji admits that the real reason he didn't go to Sokoto Peak is that he didn't really know how to be a father. And this admission is a sign of growth on his part. Where I think the scene goes wrong is where Fuyumi and Natsuo jump in, and I guess they're trying to take ownership of the part they played in this situation. But guys, you were like 11 and 8 years old when Toya disappeared. This isn't your fault. Rei's subsequent assertion that Endeavor does not bear the responsibility alone and the family will help him to put his broken heart back together is a tender offering that ultimately models poor boundaries. It should not be the responsibility of the abuse victims to comfort and rescue the abuser. Endeavor is expressing remorse here, which is progress, but the problem with the dynamic as it is in this scene is that it's centering his pain rather than the pain of the people he's harmed. This is something that happens quite often with abusive people. They express remorse, but they do so in a way that puts their own emotions at the center of the story, rather than focusing on the feelings of the people who have been wronged. So it's not unrealistic that things might play out this way, but the show doesn't demonstrate any awareness of the problematic dynamics that are happening in this scene. I also would have liked to see a little more protest from Endeavor when it comes to the decision to put Shoto up against Toya in the final matchups. This is another case where Shoto is being asked to take on his father's burdens. And even though the strategy makes sense from a combat perspective, and even though Shoto insists this is what he wants to do, Endeavor's redemption arc could have really been enhanced if we had seen him wrestle with the guilt that comes with letting his child take responsibility to clean up his mess. It's evident to me that the writers were saving a lot of emotional weight for the very last fight. And while I do wish that some of the intermediary stages of Endeavor's redemption arc had been better executed, I have to admit, the ending of this arc is very well done. Before we take a look at this deeply satisfying and poignant climax scene, let's take a little detour to ask the question of how realistic is it that a perpetrator of domestic violence could actually reform. There have been some studies done on the rates at which DV offenders do reform their behavior after going through various types of therapies or abusive partner intervention programs, and overall the results are not great. This meta-analysis from 2024 looked at 59 studies that all examined the effectiveness of some kind of intervention for people who had committed domestic violence. And what it found was that the intervention programs had little to no effect. The sad truth is that we haven't really found an intervention that consistently has a decent success rate with reforming the behavior of perpetrators of DV. actual true cases of reform are few and far between. However, that doesn't mean they never happen. I could sit here and say that Endeavor's story has an unrealistic outcome because in real life, it's very rare for abusers to actually change. However, this is not a story about succumbing to the odds when they're stacked against you. This is a story about overcoming the odds. What is one of the central themes of My Hero Academia? It's never too late to fight on our side. Everyone gets a second chance. No one is beyond redemption. If the characters who have committed the worst crimes still deserve another chance to find their goodness, then Endeavor deserves it too. The final moment of judgment arrives when Endeavor comes face to face with his son, who is crying, "Look at me," to his father. I love the way this was done, having Toya talk like a child here. The physical explanation for what's going on is that his power has overwhelmed his body so much that he can't think straight anymore. But there's a deeper symbolic meaning for what is happening here. Toya has regressed to a childlike state, to the point where his emotional wounding happened. Endeavor is not meeting his 24-year-old son, he's meeting his 5-year-old son. We have gone back in time to the point where the break in the bond happened. You can see from this shot, the expression on his face and his body posture are childlike. They are playful and eager, finding joy in the connection that he has been seeking for so long. Endeavor's expression here is one of genuine remorse and empathy. His son is asking him to look at him, and he does. He finally sees his pain. And what does Endeavor do when his son's death seems imminent and all the power and strength he spent years building up are useless to stop it? He wraps his arms around him and says, "I've got you." I cannot emphasize enough just what a beautiful moment this is from the perspective of healing the attachment trauma. Toya cannot be reasoned with because he is not an adult in this moment. His uncontrollable flames represent the uncontrollable emotions of a small child who is experiencing a deep feeling. And just like an emotionally attuned and sensitive parent must hold their young child as they ride out the tantrum, Endeavor must hold his son in a moment of comfort as he races towards death. This kind of reconciliation is rare in my experience. As a therapist, I'm typically working with people to become their own parent to their inner child because their actual parents are not really capable of going through the growth that is necessary to provide them with this kind of emotional support and repair. But here we have this rare moment where the father himself actually gets to provide repair to the son he abandoned. And we as the audience get to feel a great deal of the healing energy that is encapsulated in this moment of Endeavor's radical presence with his child. When Shoto, of course, saves the day with the help of the rest of the family, here is where we get the true moment of reckoning. When Endeavor says, "I should have gone to Sokoto Peak." This is where Endeavor finally demonstrates the ability to name and center the pain that his wife and his children have been carrying because of his actions, and offers a genuine apology for the harm he's done. It's so good. In the epilogue of the series, Endeavor makes his dying son a promise that he will show up every day. He acknowledges that he is far too late, but he is determined to do right by his child regardless. Toya's fate is a sad one, and it will never not be so. But there is some solace in knowing that at the end of his life, he is loved. We get very little information about where Enji and Rei's relationship stands at the end of the series. I think the implication is that she now finally gets to play a three-dimensional role in his life and his world, rather than being treated as a servant/baby-making machine. I do wish that in this epilogue, Enji would demonstrate a little more understanding of how he has actually harmed his wife specifically. and how he plans to make repairs to her specifically. Once again, the pain that Rei has gone through is kind of backgrounded in favor of focusing on the pain of the children. IPV relationships are extremely complicated, and especially so when it comes to couples who are attempting to reconcile after abuse. So if I was in charge of writing the script, I definitely would have dedicated more attention to how Enji and Rei's relationship is going to look going forward. Final thoughts. Let's take stock of those 3 questions that I set out to answer at the beginning of this video. Number 1. Is the show's portrayal of domestic violence realistic? I think the show does a great job of portraying multiple different types of abuse in a way that comports with the plot of the story. I also think it does a great job of portraying several different manifestations of complex PTSD, all of which are believable. The process by which Endeavor reforms is not necessarily the most realistic, but much of that is because of the genre. This is not the type of show where we see people sitting down and going to therapy or being in support groups. This is an action-based anime. The characters experience emotional growth in concordance with the progression of the plot to defeat the antagonists. So given the parameters of the genre we're working with, I do think the growth markers that are reached by the characters are realistic for the journey that they are on. Number 2. Does the show teach a healthy message about DV? With this, my verdict is more mixed. Let's start with the positives. The show elicits empathy for a domestic violence survivor who also commits a violent act herself against one of her children. This type of scenario is a common one, but it is something that is still not well understood in general by the social service system or the justice system, and that's part of the reason why so many DV survivors end up incarcerated. My Hero Academia shows Rei taking responsibility for her actions while still simultaneously putting her behavior in the context of her husband's abuse, and I think that's a healthy framing. Where the show falls short, in my opinion, is in the way it drafts the victims of abuse into the role of providing comfort and reassurance to their abuser. It doesn't demonstrate quite enough awareness of what healthy or unhealthy boundaries actually look like. I also think the story would have benefited from more information about how exactly Enji is making reparations to Rei at the end of the series. The fact that there is so little conversation between the two of them at the end could inadvertently send a message that IPV is something that can be recovered from quite easily, when the reality is that having a couple reconcile after there has been IPV is an extremely long and difficult process, and it's actually rarely accomplished successfully. I know this is a show about beating the odds, but in the case of IPV, in order for those odds to be beaten, the abuser actually has to demonstrate an understanding of the nuanced way in which he has wielded power and control in the relationship, as well as an understanding of what an egalitarian relationship actually looks like. There simply wasn't enough engagement between Enji and Rei at the end of the show to really demonstrate that he has that understanding. Okay, let's move on to the final question. Does Endeavor deserve his redemption arc? And does he fumble it, or does he truly redeem himself? I've already given my answer to the first part of this question. I think everyone deserves redemption. And in a show like this, that seems to be on a quest to find the goodness in everyone, you can't not give him the opportunity. By the end of the series, I do think Endeavor has truly redeemed himself. He demonstrates many signs of growth, taking ownership of his wrongs without making excuses for them, receiving criticism and anger from his children while keeping his own emotions regulated, releasing his children from any burden of responsibility and committing to shielding them from the blowback from his mistakes, recognizing that there are no quick fixes, that this process of repair will be long and enduring. As a therapist who works with adult children of emotionally immature parents, I very rarely hear about success stories. I very rarely hear stories of parents who are able to take true accountability for the harms they've caused. It's nice to be able to see a success story. Even if it isn't real, I feel like it's real for someone. Maybe I was drawn to these characters because I am someone who would like to know what it would feel like to see your parent truly change. And if you, like me, were drawn to this story in the hope that it might give you that feeling of repair that you've always been looking for, well, I hope you got what you came for.